All right, good morning. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington. I'd like to welcome all of you to this special panel on Arab elections and democracy. It's great for the first time in a few weeks to focus on a positive element in the region in a way. We've been focusing on all kinds of crises and somewhat, well, there is a little light at the end of the tunnel, but at the same time, we're warning you in the subtitle between authoritarianism, conflict, and sectarianism, so it's not necessarily a celebration of the advent of democracy in the region yet, but that's what we're here. We're to kind of discuss a serious development and a serious topic involving several Arab countries, particularly Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Tunisia. And we're delighted to have a panel of experts that day in, day out spend a lot of time on this particular issue and on these particular countries that I mentioned. I will leave it up to the panel chair to introduce the speakers. So let me just introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Dan Brumberg, who is the Director of Democracy and Governance Studies at Georgetown University. And he is also a Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington. He will be introducing the topic and also introducing the speakers and conducting the question and answer session. Dan, the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Khalil. I'm delighted to be here. I'm actually just back from spending 2 weeks in Tunisia, and so I am eager to hear from my colleagues about all these countries and particularly, I suppose, Tunisia. Before I introduce our speakers, all of whom are colleagues and friends, Khalil's have been a buddy of mine for quite a few years as well. I want to just say a couple of framing comments here. I mean, elections, it's not as if the Arab world didn't have elections. Authoritarian regimes thrived by manipulating elections, and that is a legacy that we are still dealing with in the region. But of course, since the so-called Arab Spring of 2011, the Arab political revolts or rebellions, the prospect for elections meaning something more than either an avenue of sectarian conflict or an arena for maintaining autocracy, the possibility of that has emerged. Of course, in the first couple of years or few years following the 2011 events, things looked mighty grim. But I think Khalil mentioned, and we have some interesting developments, at least in part of the Arab world, in terms of elections, and the possibility that elections may serve not as an avenue of maintaining or channeling conflict of identity-based or economic conflict, but that elections might actually serve as a basis for framing and channeling democratic pluralist competition. So that is something that we're obviously talking about today. The general rule of thumb for people like myself who work on this issue is that democratic elections and democracy has to do two things. It has to provide certainty of outcome to the extent that those who who participate in elections don't perceive the possibility that the result of an election will be their political exclusion. If they fear that, it's very difficult to have a democratic election. So you have to have a certain amount of certainty. But democracy is also about uncertainty. And if those who lose elections don't have a prospect of winning, they're not going to participate. So there has to be some give and pull. So the challenge now in all these countries that we're talking about today, I think, with possible exception of Egypt, where the situation, I think Steve would agree, is more grim in that remark. But the other cases suggest the possibility of a process of consolidation whereby the balance between certainty and uncertainty between elections that reassure the losers that they'll participate and reassure the participants that the electoral game is not there to exclude them, the possibility of that is there, and that's what we call in political science democratic consolidation. That is democratic consolidation. So one of the interesting questions is that what we're seeing here? Or is it something that really echoes some of the old legacies of elections as a means of reinforcing autocracy and or channeling sectarian conflict? The interesting question that is raised by elections in Lebanon and in Iraq recently, and also in Tunisia in its own way, is whether we're perhaps transiting from a kind of sectarian framework to something else. So there's a lot of questions to answer or to probe or to discuss. And the last one I want to mention, of course, and how our speakers tackle this question is completely up to them, of course. But one of the major issues is what regional players do and global players do in terms of affecting these electoral outcomes. We can't think about elections in any of these countries as happening without being affected by the regional politics. So there's a lot on the table here for today's discussion. So I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order that they're going to speak. Each will speak 10 or 11 minutes, and I will do my best to corral them and maintain some amount of discipline as we move ahead, so we have half an hour more or less for discussion. So our first speaker is Stephen McInerney, who joined POMED as its advisory director in 2007, and of course is now executive director of POMED, which is probably the leading organization in Washington that really works on issues of democratization in the Middle East as the central focus of their concern and their activities. Following Steve will be Paul Salem, who is Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Programs at the Middle East Institute. He focuses on political change, transition, and conflict in the Middle East. And Paul is also an old buddy of mine. I don't mean old in the sense of old. And then I'm delighted to have with us for today's speaker as well, Rend Al-Rahim. I haven't seen Rend in a few years, let's put it this way. And Rend will be talking, of course, about elections, and Rend is president of the Iraq Foundation, a foundation that has been around in Washington for a good many years now and has been doing important work on politics and political change in Iraq. And finally, Charles Dunne, who will be speaking about events in Tunisia, where I've just come back from. Charles is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center in Washington. He was a diplomat for 24 years with tours in Cairo, Jerusalem, and Madras. He was director of Middle East and North Africa programs at Freedom House and also worked for a particular amount of time on Tunisia as well. So, Charles will be talking about recent elections in Tunisia. So let's start with Steve, and we'll go on from there. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And thanks to the Arab Center for organizing this discussion and for inviting me. Dan kind of opened by posing the question of whether these elections represent kind of consolidation, democratic consolidation, but he sort of acknowledged that while that may be the case in some of the other countries, Egypt sadly is an exception. And certainly, I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone that Egypt's elections, I don't represent, democratic progress, but rather authoritarian retrenchment. The elections that recently took place, presidential elections that took place at the end of March in Egypt, were certainly the least competitive of the four elections that are being discussed today, and the least interesting electorally. But nonetheless, I do think that while the elections were neither free nor fair nor competitive, I think these elections, the presidential elections, actually were quite important politically, and were actually quite important political event. And quite revealing, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that in the next few minutes. Just to begin, maybe I'll step back maybe a year ago, and as we were looking toward the presidential elections that were scheduled for March of this year, in which President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was going to be seeking a second term. As you all know, President Sisi seized power when the military removed President Mohamed Morsi from power in 2013, and President Sisi then was elected president formally in 2014. In March of this year, he was running for re-election. Over the past year, there was a lot of speculation as to what this election might look like. The speculation generally assumed that it would not be a free and fair and open competitive election. There was no real expectation that President Sisi was in any danger of not being reelected. But there were questions about what issues might be raised during the period of campaigning, and exactly who might try to contest the elections as a candidate, as an opponent to President Sisi. There was speculation that Khaled Ali, a sort of leftist opposition figure who had risen to prominence, among other things, by criticizing the decision to return a couple of islands in the Red Sea from Egyptian territory to Saudi Arabia, which is a very controversial issue. There's speculation and expectation that he may run. There was discussion of Mohammed Anwar Sadat, the nephew of former President Sadat, running, as well as a couple of former figures from the Egyptian military, Ahmed Shafiq and Sami Anan. And there was speculation as to whether either of those figures would be allowed to run. As the elections neared, at the end of November, there was a somewhat surprising announcement, which was that Ahmed Shafiq announced on the 29th of November that he was going to run in the presidential election. The following day, on November 30th, Ahmed Konsowa, who was also from the Egyptian military, an army colonel, announced his intention to run in the elections. Konsowa was subsequently detained, arrested, and sentenced quickly to 6 years in prison by a military court for announcing his candidacy while wearing a military uniform, despite the fact that Sisi had done the same in 2014. With Ahmed Shafiq, who was the first to announce his candidacy, he announced his candidacy while he was in the UAE. A number of days later, he was actually deported to Egypt and held in a hotel incommunicado, was not allowed to interact with anyone, was not allowed access to communication or telephone or internet. And then on the 7th of January, he announced that he was withdrawing his candidacy, with the widespread understanding being that this was following his being detained and threats upon himself and or his family by the government. I would add that during this period of kind of December and early January, I think there was an unexpected level of excitement and buzz around the election. The registration period for candidates was open until the 28th of January. And the fact that Ahmed Shafiq, in particular, announced his candidacy was seen as surprising, and it ignited hopes among Egyptians, which you could see from talking with Egyptians or from following, online on social media, that there might actually be there's sort of short-lived hope that there might actually be a competitive election. Sami Anan, on the 19th of January, announced his candidacy. He was a former Army Chief of Staff, a figure, like Ahmed Shafiq, who was not a real opposition figure historically. He was sort of someone from the establishment, someone who had been part of the Egyptian regime for many years and part of the military itself. And his announcement, as well as Ahmed Shafiq's announcement, were seen not only as indicating their own desire to run for president, but there was some understanding that neither would have done so without some significant backing from the military establishment and from within the regime itself, and that was widely understood as revealing some splits within the regime to a degree that was maybe not widely understood. 3 days after announcing his candidacy, Sami Anan was arrested and disqualified from running. It was announced that he had never formally resigned or not had his resignation from the military accepted prior to his announcement. Khalid Ali, who I mentioned earlier, had announced his intention to run on December 26th, but on January 24th announced that he was withdrawing from the election, citing concerns that it would not be free and fair. There was also a pending political charges brought against him, and it was not clear whether he would be allowed to run. Mohammed Anwar Sadat, who was the nephew of former President Sadat, held a press conference on January 15th, in which it was widely expected that he might announce his candidacy, but instead at the press conference he announced his decision not to run, citing fears about the safety of workers that were part of his campaign and doubts about the fairness of the process. This left, in late January, with only a few days before the deadline, it left no opponent in the race, to President Sisi. On January 28th, which was the last day in which to register to run an election, Mustafa Musa, who was a previously unknown figure who had actually campaigned for President Sisi and had been part of a campaign to collect signatures in support of President Sisi's campaign, suddenly, unexpectedly announced on the final day as the sort of token so-called opposition candidate. So that left a field that had no meaningful opposition. The only candidate on the ballot other than President Sisi was someone who was an open public supporter of President Sisi. To me, it was very reminiscent of the presidential election in 2005, which the first time there were more than one candidate on the ballot when President Mubarak was running, and many of his so-called opponents actually would praise him during the campaign events. So as an electoral exercise, the election became rather meaningless as we moved then toward the actual voting at the end of March. Voting took place over 3 days, March 26th, 27th, and 28th. One question, really the only question, was what would turnout be, and also I guess to some degree what percentage of votes would go to this sort of token opposition candidate, Mustafa Musa. In the end, Sisi won with 97% of the vote, which is the same as his election in 2014. Mustafa Musa won 2.9% of the vote. The number of invalid voted or blank votes cast as sort of protest votes was actually about 3 times as many as those cast for Mustafa Musa. The turnout, official turnout numbers were 41.5% of the vote. It was a little bit lower than the 47% official turnout numbers for 2014. The reality is that all of these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt or more. The unfortunate reality is that when elections take place in a closed political environment, which their opposition candidates are not allowed to run, genuinely independent election observers are not present, and there's no kind of free and fair or free or open media environment. The reality is that even though Sisi ran essentially unopposed, the regime was very much concerned about turnout, and a lot of effort was put into turning people out to vote. It appeared, observationally, anecdotally, that the turnout was in fact quite low. There was, I watched television coverage of the election, and it was, to me, reminiscent of the election in 2005, where the polling stations were mostly empty, and it was a stark contrast to the elections in the parliamentary elections in 2011 and 12, and the presidential elections in 2012, in which there were lines of hundreds of people waiting in polling stations to vote, and that's not surprising. On one hand, the President Sisi and his regime wanted a high turnout to increase the sort of credibility and legitimacy for the elections, but on the other hand, always the best way to get a high turnout is to have a competitive election, and we see the same here in the States. Fewer people to turn out if a candidate is running unopposed, and the more competitive and the more uncertain the outcome, the more interest there is and the more likelihood there is of people voting. So that's just a quick overview of what took place. I mentioned at the outset that while this wasn't an interesting election from an electoral point of view or from political point of view of political competition, I do think it was interesting politically. And what I mean by that is that it revealed first, a desire by people, including from the Egyptian regime, Egyptian military, Egyptian kind of establishment, for there to be some sort of alternative to President Sisi. And figures like Shafiq and Annan trying to run, but then being not allowed to run, particularly Annan, immediately after seeing the example of Ahmed Shafiq. Ahmed Shafiq tried to run, was clearly disallowed from running. Despite that, days later, Sami Annan tried to run anyway. When each of them made their announcements, there was some speculation that they wouldn't have run without assurances that they would be allowed to run or certainly not be arrested. But obviously, in hindsight, that was not the case. But it showed that despite not being given kind of a green light or permission to run, that they were willing to do so. And the kind of, as I mentioned, the excitement and buzz around their potential candidacy, or just even the prospect of there being a real candidate, was palpable and very strong. I think also that while this was somewhat unexpected, it was not only unexpected to those of us, political observers of Egyptian politics. I think this was also unexpected to President Sisi and many of his close advisors within the regime. I think they were somewhat caught off guard, and I think he was surprised that figures from the military establishment tried to run against him, and that he had to respond, in kind to prevent that. Sadly, what we've seen since then has been very discouraging. There was some speculation in the lead up to the March election. There was obviously this sort of crackdown on opponents and potential opponents. There was crackdown on media. And among many Egyptian friends and colleagues, there's speculation as to whether this crackdown would let up following the election, or whether it might even worsen. And sadly, the clear outcome has been the latter. Now looking back in hindsight, it appears that many figures who took actions during this election period that the regime was unhappy with, while the direct candidates were sort of removed and in some cases arrested during the pre-election period, there were many other figures that have now been since arrested. The past month or so has been especially depressing in that regard. Our organization put out a publication on Friday kind of tracking some of the most prominent arrests. We have put together this kind of fact sheet, which is, it's a wide variety of different types of political figures. Includes Abdul Manam Abu Fattouh, who had run for president in the presidential election in 2012. He was among many prominent figures who had actually called for a boycott of this election. He was arrested in February. Hisham Geneina, who was the former head of the Central Auditing Authority and kind of seen as a figure in trying to fight corruption within the regime, has been arrested and convicted. And then a number of analysts, political activists, scholars, journalists have been arrested. For the past 4 or 5 weeks, there hasn't been a week that has passed without prominent figures being arrested. We published this on Friday. The next day, on Saturday, Hazem Abdelazim, who's a very prominent younger generation activist, who was actually part of Sisi's presidential campaign in 2014, but has since kind of become a critic, was arrested the day after this was published. On the day that this was published, the most common feedback that we got online was, oh, well, you left out this person, you left out this other person. And so it's actually been a broad crackdown. And I think that this is somewhat the result of Sisi being kind of taken back and surprised by the degree to which there were voices willing to try to stand against him and criticize him during the election period. And so now that the elections have passed, he's taking steps to try to ensure that will not be the case in the future. So I think that leaves Egypt on a sort of very negative trajectory. But I'll leave my remarks there.
Thank you. Sisi's would-be rivals remind me of the fact that in Egypt, while you have freedom of speech, you don't have freedom after speech, which is a critical difference. But I think what Steve said was very important, because these regimes, they're really not concerned so much about popular opposition. They're concerned about splits within the regime, because that's the beginning of problems. And as soon as you have those, they get the fangs out, don't they? Because they can't tolerate any degree of uncertainty in their control of the political situation, and that's where we're at. All right, let's turn to a very different case. Paul, you're going to talk about Lebanon for us and elections, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Arab Center for hosting this. About the Lebanese elections that were held in May, the parliamentary elections, a number of sort of overall remarks. First, it was very important that elections were held. They had been postponed twice. This parliament had overstayed its mandate by 5 years. So it had been 9 years since the last elections were held, and that was sort of putting in jeopardy the whole constitutional and institutional framework of the Lebanese Republic, such as it is. So it was very good that elections were held at all, generally free and fair, and generally results that represented, I think, the voting patterns of the population, and we can talk more about that. The elections are within a consociational political system, so not a majoritarian political system, a system of power sharing, a system of fixed representation of different communities in parliament and in government and in the major offices of the government. This formula, this system goes back almost all the way back to 1926. That constitution and the first elections held in 1927, adjusted in 1943, adjusted again in 1990 after the long Civil War. So in a way, this is a rather old system with some variations here and there. It is a system, maybe elements of which we are seeing, I would say, in Iraq, and maybe we'll hear more about that, for better or for worse, in the Iraqi case. It might be a type of system that eventually, the only type of system that might bring stability to Syria, although that is nowhere in the current trajectory of Syria, unfortunately. It's quite remarkable that elections are held in this small, stressed country in a very difficult neighborhood, bitter civil war going on in Syria, Israeli-Syrian, Israeli-Iranian tensions, a political system in Lebanon which is very deeply split over the situation in Syria and vis-a-vis Iran and Saudi Arabia, and yet that you can hold a peaceful, free and fair election in a country where Muslims and Christians are coexisting, Sunnis and Shias are coexisting, whereas there is bloodshed just a couple of hours east in Syria. So that's quite an achievement as well. The elections were held based on a new election law, the first time that proportional representation is used as the basis for elections in Lebanon. That had been something that was raised by civil society for the past 20 years. Now, of course, politicians adopted it for their own reasons, but I think it's quite something that a fundamental reform of the most important law in the land, which is the election law, was introduced by civil society, was campaigned for by civil society. Now the politicians, as I said, adopted it for their own reasons, but I still think that's a very important development. Proportional representation is complex in Lebanon because there also is a confessional quota system, so it gets a bit complicated. But the system was used. Candidates and voters figured out, how it works and voted accordingly. And I think it created results that are fairly accurately reflecting where the voters stand. This new election law opens the door for fundamental political change, but the door being open doesn't mean that many voters walk through it. Civil society, for the first time, fielded 68 candidates. Only one of them made it into a 128-seat parliament, but that's one more than has happened in the last century. But whereas the election law is really quite a development, the political communities, political society, politics remains very much a patron-client kind of service-oriented election system, heavy role for sectarianism, and new parties, whether they're civil society groups or others, will probably need a fair amount of time to figure out how to do electioneering, how to garner votes, and maybe do better in the next election. In terms of results, the results do bring change, but minor change, not major change. Why do I say that? Because the power sharing system in the country doesn't fundamentally change, although the results of the election shifted from a small majority that had been held by what was known as the March 14 coalition, which was very much anti-Assad and so on. That majority had been held since 2005. That majority was lost. And it was lost to a broad coalition that includes Hezbollah and Amal, sort of the hardcore Hezbollah people, and assorted allies, as well as the president's own Free Patriotic Movement. If you take all of that coalition, they did get a majority in the new parliament. It is a simple majority, not a two-thirds majority. That's important because you need a two-thirds majority to elect a president or to change the constitution or to do anything major. The results of the election also need to be read in terms of politics. That the deciding bloc in the new parliament is the president's bloc. He has about 28, 29 seats between him and his close allies, and he can determine the majority, meaning if the president's bloc sides with Hezbollah and Amal, they have a majority in parliament. If he sides with the Future Movement and their allies, he also has a majority in parliament. This was not the case before these elections, and that effectively makes the president quite influential in this new arrangement of power. The president, as I often describe it, ran from the right but governs from the center. That in order to become president, he had to, since the road for him was blocked by March 14, he sided with March 8 and eventually made it to the presidency, but he needs to govern from the center in order for his presidency to be a success. The center means don't anger Hezbollah and the Iranians too much, but reach out to the Saudis and the Europeans and the Americans in order to gain investment and any positive growth and job creation, things that are necessary for his presidency to be deemed a success and for his son-in-law, Gibran Bassil, to make a credible run for the presidency. Why I also say it's not a tremendous difference is that the governing formula, which has been in place since President Aoun was elected president, was that Saad al-Hariri would be prime minister, regardless of whether he commands a majority or in parliament or not. Aoun remains president and Nabih Berri remains speaker of parliament. That same governing formula prevailed before the election and prevails now as Hariri is trying to form a government. The state and the president as well as the government still has to straddle what you might call kind of an east-west divide, that it has to not anger Hezbollah, Assad, and the Iranians too much, but has to maintain and build good relations with the Gulf partners, the Europeans and the Americans, in order to have economic and political support. That same straddling existed before the election and will be attempted after the elections. In terms of how Hezbollah sees the results, definitely it is a victory for them with a small v. As I said, it's not a major change. But they also have things to worry about. That their main ally in the Christian community, Michel Aoun, did not do as well as expected. Their main opponent in the Christian community, Samir Ja'ja and the Lebanese forces, did much better than expected. That means that their main ally is losing ground in the Maronite and Christian community. It also means that when President Aoun, who is not a young man and not in the best of health, when he does pass on, it's going to be very difficult for his son-in-law, Gibran Bassil, to maintain the same level of support in the Christian community, and that's something for Hezbollah to worry about. He's been their main ally for over a decade. In the Sunni community, they're pleased that Saad al-Hariri did not do well, but they can't be too pleased about why he did not do well. Part of that is that many Sunnis are not happy with the closeness he has with Hezbollah. So it doesn't mean that the Sunni community is more comfortable with Hezbollah. That is not what the results showed. So they still have an enormous problem of relations in the Sunni community. And in the Druze community, Walid Jumblat, who's really not a friend of theirs, maintained a very tight hold. So, yes, elections results somewhat went their way, but they still have fundamental challenges. I'll end with a few remarks about sort of the challenges that the government faces. One is forming the government. That's what's going on right now. It is likely to be a broad coalition government with most parties inside the government rather than outside. That's rather typical of the power-sharing system, typical of a consociational democratic system, that people are inside sharing spoils, sharing decision-making, rather than having a majority-minority oppositional system. There's some bickering about, who gets which ministry as usual, but government formation is expected to be fairly rapid because the president and the government, as is Hezbollah and others, are aware that it's in everybody's interest to have a government in place, particularly to make good on hopes of support from the international community on economic issues. There will be a struggle over the government statement, as is usually the case, what's going to be in that official policy statement. Particularly, how will Hezbollah, the resistance as it's called, be framed? How will that issue be framed in the government statement? Prime Minister Hariri, or Prime Minister-designate Hariri, has come under a lot of pressure from the US, from the Saudis after the elections to put some more distance between himself and Hezbollah and Aoun. He's made some changes to his own advisors and so on, and is moving a bit closer to Samir Ja'ja and the Christian opposition. How that will be reflected in the government statement, we shall see. As I said, the government wants to be formed quickly because there are a number of international aid conferences to Lebanon. One already happened in Paris. There's another to be held in Brussels and one in Rome. And the government is hoping to get significant economic support and support for the army and the internal security forces, and it doesn't want to ruin that. All of this proceeds under very dark cloud of the risk of a war between Israel and Iran in Syria, which might quickly spread to Lebanon and completely devastate Lebanon. That's not something the Lebanese state can much control. Tensions were very high about a month ago. I would say that the last few days have seen a decline of those tensions and maybe some agreement between the Israelis and Russians over Iranian presence in Syria. And finally, the US-Iranian tensions and escalations and what that might mean for pressure on Hezbollah and Lebanon is also a concern. So a lot of clouds in the horizon. I'll stop there and thank you. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Paul. Your mention of the U.S.-Iran situation looms over everything, not irrelevant to Iraq. So, Rend, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Arab Center for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So on Iraq, we seem to have a season of elections in this region, right? 2018 is election year. With all the shortcomings and the problems that we see in Iraq, I think one can fairly say that Iraq has a dynamic political system. And that if we're talking in terms of a democratic framework, obviously this is an evolving thing, but it certainly in Iraq shows promise, as opposed to, say, a country like Egypt, where there is indeed a retreat. So this is a flawed system, a system with shortcomings, but nevertheless there is movement and there is hope for change and so on. The Iraqi situation is similar, as I will point out, in many respects to the Lebanese situation. There are many aspects that are parallel. A long time ago, people used to say, don't Lebanonize Iraq, and then they started saying, don't Iraqi-ize Lebanon, and so there's a sort of a back and forth of comparison and fears that each country will sort of mimic the other. I want to start with general remarks, and I want to talk about the shortcomings of the elections and the successes of the elections, and then put it in a geopolitical context. So more than being dynamic, these elections are repetitive. These are the fifth set of elections that we've had in Iraq since 2003. And they have happened on schedule, despite all the difficulties, despite the fears that they're not going to be done perfectly. They have happened on time. And part of that has been international pressure. I mean, Iraq is under the eyes of the international community. We have a UN mission called UNAMI in Iraq. All UNAMI and the other UN agencies and the embassies and so on tend to put pressure on Iraq to hold elections on time. But nevertheless, we have had 5 elections more or less on time, as opposed to Lebanon, where it was 5 years overdue. They are certainly competitive. In fact, they're fiercely competitive. And a lot of money is spent in the American style on these elections. They tend to be inclusive. Now, in terms of free and fair, there have been accusations of fraud, of vote selling, and so on in these past elections. And this is an issue that is holding up the Election Commission, holding up the endorsement of the candidates who have won, and so on. So there is a cloud over that. But this happens with every elections we have in Iraq. With every elections, after the votes are counted, the people who have lost say that there is fraud, there have been irregularities, and so on. So this happens every time, possibly more so this time, and I'll explain a little bit why. But on the whole, these elections do qualify as a sort of pointer towards democratic transition. Now, of course, elections are a necessary component of democracy, but not a sufficient component. But nevertheless, these are, in Iraq's case, the elections have been a good indicator of the democratic evolution and where the country is headed to. So let me speak a little bit about the shortcomings of the elections. The first problem, and this can be seen in Egypt, in Lebanon, possibly also in Tunisia, is the disappointingly low turnout. Now, in 2014, turnout was 62%. This year, turnout was 44.5%. And in fact, there was a very powerful movement to boycott the elections, and this was all over social media and so on. And this phenomenon of low turnout, certainly in Iraq, is a result of extreme distrust of the political process, cynicism about political leaders, disillusionment with the performance of successive governments, and a belief that my vote cannot change anything. Why should I go and vote? Because I will only be endorsing not only a flawed process, but a corrupt process. I will be endorsing corrupt politicians who are self-serving, who have neglected the population for the last 15 years. So there was a great deal of abstention from the votes because of that. And I think that may be also true, for example, in Lebanon, which I follow a little bit. So the sense of distrust of politicians, of the political process, and of the ability of voters to make any change towards the better has been entrenched in the Iraqi psyche, certainly over the last perhaps 5, 6, and more years. I think in 2014, there was hope for change, but in fact, the arrival of ISIS, the relinquishing of the central government of a third of the country to ISIS, the breakdown of the Iraqi army, its retreat, and so on, were a shock to the Iraqi system and a realization or a belief that a growing belief that our governments have failed us repeatedly, and the ceding of territory to ISIS without a fight was, in a sense, the final blow, which created this disillusion. Secondly, we really don't have political parties in Iraq. I mean, there are perhaps two political parties one can point to. One of them is the Communist Party, which is a very old party, and that continues to function as a party. The other one, which has until recently functioned as a party, is the Dawa Party, but the Dawa Party broke apart in 2015, 2016, with two factions, one following former Prime Minister Maliki, one following current Prime Minister Abadi. So even the Dawa Party, which did sort of have all the trappings of a proper political party, has disintegrated. We don't have political parties in Iraq. What we have is political leaders around whom acolytes and cronies aggregate. Again, I think there's a similarity with Lebanon here. So, for example, you have Maliki. Maliki doesn't have a political party. His list does not represent a political party. What he has is personal adherents. Abdulaziz al-Hakim or Ammar al-Hakim, the young scion of the Hakim family, again doesn't have a party. They did have a political entity which has fragmented. He now is simply a political figure with a long family history of leadership, and people come and gather around him as Ammar al-Hakim and not as the head of a political party. Similarly with the Sunnis, the Sunni Brotherhood Party, of course, was there, but that has fallen apart in recent years. The Kurds, the KDP, certainly is a political party, although I'm not sure to what extent it can be described as a true political party because of the leadership of the Barzanis is so powerful, it sort of obscures the structure of the party. The PUK, of course, has fallen apart since Jalal Talabani's demise. And so, again, there is no party system that people can turn to and and look at programs and so on. It's a sort of an amorphous political scene. We have a problem, like Lebanon, of sectarian politics. Now, this has been going on at least since 2003. A lot of people blame the Americans. I also blame the Americans, but I also blame Iraqi political parties for entrenching sectarian ethnic politics into the political system. And unfortunately, this has been continuing in election after election because it's a very easy populist appeal. If you're a Shia or if you're a Sunni, then you appeal to the Shia out of their fears of a return of Sunni power. If you're a Sunni, then you appeal to the Sunnis out of their fear of Shia hegemony and control and Shia oppression of Sunnis. The Kurds, of course, have their own narrative and so on. But we have had this perpetuation of sectarian politics up until these elections. Now, in the last couple of years, I would say, there has been a strong movement in Iraq away, or trying to move away, let's be precise, from sectarianism, from politics defined by sect or ethnicity. And this has been a movement that has been championed by civil society, by secular groups, of course. And there is a mood in the country that we have not gained by sectarian politics. We have elected sectarian politicians time and time again. Not only have they not served the country, they have not served the citizens who belong to that sect. What is very interesting is the greatest outcry against Shia politicians in these last elections has come from southern Iraq, where there is a vast majority, an overwhelming majority of Shia. In the Sunni provinces in the last elections, they ousted almost all the previous Sunni politicians, including the current Speaker of the House, in favor of new people because they felt that the Sunni politicians had let them down. In Nineveh province, perhaps the most affected by ISIS, they voted, oh, really? They voted for, 2 minutes, for the list of the Prime Minister. So there are lots of flaws in the elections, but I want to talk about some successes and some achievements, actually. First of all, these elections were truly unpredictable. And everyone I meet, whether Iraqi or non, says, what a surprise. Obviously, one of the biggest surprises is the electoral alliance between Muqtada Sadr, erstwhile an Islamist Shia firebrand, with the Communist Party, and their rise to the first position in the elections. there are many reasons for that. They have been collaborating for the last 3 years in demonstrations and protest movements against corruption, against politicians who don't provide services, on issues of electricity, and so on. So they have been forming an alliance. And Muqtada al-Sadr has come a long way in his thinking about the politics of Iraq. I said he was a Shia firebrand. He no longer uses a Shia sectarian rhetoric, and that reflects another element in the country which is more towards, we don't call it sectarian politics in Iraq, that's taboo, we call it civic politics, Madani. So Muqtada al-Sadr has been moving more and more in the direction of abandoning an Islamist political platform, a Shia political platform, and more towards a civic platform, which enabled him to combine with the communist. The other very important factor is the fact that almost 2/3 of the current incumbents in parliament have lost their seats. And only about a little over 90 were returned to parliament. There are some very prominent names who lost their seats in parliament. As I mentioned, the Speaker of the House is one of them. And this is one of the reasons that the election results have been contested and there have been accusations of fraud and vote selling and so on, because over 200 MPs were not returned to office. So the possibility of change is there, which makes it rather ironic that so many people abstained, that 56%, or yes, 56% of the population abstained from voting, believing they cannot bring change. Well, the results of the elections showed that you can bring about change, in fact, and that in Iraq, it may not be possible, say, in Egypt, or may not be as possible in Lebanon, but in Iraq, there is an open door for change. If I could have 1 minute just to talk about the geopolitical.
We're going to have to move on.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. I hate to put my foot down. It's such an interesting subject. We'll get back to some questions on Iraq, but we want to let little Tunisia, poor little Tunisia, which is often not the subject of enough discussion in this town.
We only have 8 million people there, so it
Trying to
is.
drum up some sympathy for our last speaker. You've got 10 minutes, and we're going to give it to you, so go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. You know, it's become a cliche by now, and I've read it in a million publications, that it's the only remaining success story from the countries that experienced significant upheaval during the Arab Spring that started in 2011. And it's true, they kicked it off with the ouster of Ben Ali in a by and large peaceful revolution. Freedom House notes that it took just 4 years for Tunisia to jump up the ranks from countries rated not free to countries rated free. And this is largely due to the fact that they enacted a democratic constitution, significant guarantees for human rights, and, of course, as in Iraq, they held free and fair elections with international observers and a really effective election commission overseeing the process and encouraging voter turnout. Over the last year or so, however, this record has really been put into jeopardy. Again, Freedom House has described it in its most recent report, Freedom in the World 2018, that it's really in danger of slipping back down the ladder towards the countries that are partly free. And there's just quite a few reasons for this, actually, but let me just briefly name a few. There have been a number of civilians, for example, who have been remanded to military courts for trials, and other placed under travel restrictions under the 2015 emergency regulations that were put in place after a series of terrorist attacks. Freedom of expression, as it has been in so many other countries in the region, is under serious threat. Many people have been prosecuted legally, for example, for criticizing the president or the judiciary or other institutions. Journalists have been reported for doing have been remanded for trial for doing their jobs, such as reporting on pending legislation or political deal making in the parliament. And I think the most serious problem right now, and one that a lot of observers cite, is the fact that the transitional justice process is now in jeopardy. And this was one of the centerpieces of their transition to government. They had an entire government ministry devoted to transitional justice, investigating, prosecuting, and correcting the abuses of the previous regime. Well, the parliament has passed a law that, gives civil servants who were just tangentially involved in corruption a free pass if they didn't profit from it personally, but maybe their bosses did. And very few people have been held accountable for torture under the old regime. Worst of all, I think, the parliament voted in April to simply not renew the mandate of the Truth and Dignity Commission, which is supposed to investigate all these crimes as a centerpiece of achieving national reconciliation. So, in this troubling context, these municipal elections took place across the country, and in my view, they couldn't have happened at a better time. They were important both as an exercise in basic democracy, but also an opportunity to signal displeasure with the state of the country and the state of the politicians, which I think was a very important factor, especially important since we're going into presidential and parliamentary elections next year. These elections for municipal bodies also stand to address a very important problem, and one that has been hampering, in my view, Tunisia's successful democratic transition. And this is basically the weakness of local authority across the country. And this weakness stems from the primary fact that decision-making is centered in Tunis, and especially decision-making over budgets and revenue sharing with the provinces. Now, the 2014 Constitution included provisions to rectify all this. There were supposed to be municipal elections. Excuse me. They were supposed to have taken place in 2016. They were postponed 4 times until now, just this month. None of these provisions about what municipal bodies would do once they were elected were enacted. So you could have had the elections, theoretically speaking, but none of these people elected would have anything actually to do. Well, fortunately, on May 1st, the Tunisian parliament passed a new law specifying the authorities of the municipal bodies. So this was a big step forward and really made sure that something was at stake in this election. I should say that there were existing local councils, but these are all appointed by the Ben Ali regime. They weren't responsive to their constituents, and they were largely unchanged in both form and function for decades. So all of this, the fact that the municipalities did not have control over resources that came their way, they had ineffective and unresponsive local councils, all added to a sense of disenfranchisement and, more importantly, disconnection between the provinces and Tunis, and led to a general sense of political disaffection, in some cases disaffection with the direction of democracy itself. It certainly contributed to the uprising against Ben Ali in 2011. So for that reason, these elections were seen as a major step in the democratic transition in Tunisia by starting the process of shifting real responsibility to the municipalities and the regions. Ultimately, it's also a very significant step in creating a more accountable government in the center itself. Now, to get to the result of the elections, they were a bit of a mixed bag. Independents won with about 32.2% of the vote. As for the 2 main parties, who were governing in a parliamentary coalition, the moderate Islamist Ennahda party, they received 28.6%, and the secularist Nida Tunis party, from which the president, Qaid Essebsi, comes from, got about 20.8%. Just like in some of the other elections in the region, turnout was very low, about 33.7% of the electorate compared to about 60% who turned out for the parliamentary elections in 2014. Now, there are a few reasons for these results and for the low turnout. First, Tunisians were expressing their dissatisfaction with the governing style and the achievements, frankly, of the 2 main parties and for the government ministries. the fact that they're governing in coalition has been allowing them to strike secret deals without transparency or accountability, and to manage things basically as they please, largely behind the scenes. Also, corruption remains a huge problem for the country, in many ways worse than it was under Ben Ali, and this problem has been largely unaddressed as Ennahda and Nida Tunis go on their merry way. Tunisians were also expressing their dismay with the economy, which remains a huge issue. 64% of Tunisians in polling conducted by the International Republican Institute last year described economic problems, which includes unemployment and so on and so forth, as the main problem for the country. So I see my time is up, basically. Let me just get, I will cut to the chase then. Low turnout has a lot of reasons, including dissatisfaction with the government and the fact that you don't get high turnouts for municipal elections generally. But we'll see, I think, a big change in that in the main elections coming up next year. But what I want to emphasize here is, in addition to the fact that it's setting the stage for a major transfer of authority and resources, which could be very helpful in the democratic transition, I want to point out this, and now think about this. 57,000 candidates throughout the country stood for 7,000 municipal offices in 350 municipalities. This is a huge increase in the number of candidates who are experiencing electoral politics for the first time, a huge increase in people who are seeing on a very local level what it means to run for office. This is the way expertise and experience in both elections and government are built up. And more citizens are now being given the opportunity not only to run, but to experience the political process. In short, this is how democracies are built over time, by the repeated exercise of the electoral process and by constantly expanding the pool of politicians and those who vote for them. So by this standard alone, I think the Tunisian municipal elections were a significant success in the country's political transition. And I think they really also succeeded in sending a message to the central government and to the two main parties about what are the big issues of concern coming up for next year. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have an enormously ambitious schedule here and very different and interesting political systems. So I thank everybody on the panel for giving us really a lot of food to chew on. Now, I've been reminded to remind you that we are using question cards that are going to be given to me in a very non-democratic process. I'm going to be looking at the cards and asking the questions. So what's that? So get your questions up here. Thank you so much. Here we'll start with a question about Egypt, actually. In discussing turnout of Egyptian elections, can you please address Sisi's efforts to push for voter participation of Egyptian, I can't read this here.
Egyptians expats abroad, maybe?
Egyptian
Diaspora. Okay, diaspora, right. And its impact, in other words, what Egyptian voters did outside of the country and whether they were relevant at all. Thank you.
Sure. Let's see. So there was voting that took place outside the country over, I believe, 3 days in advance of the voting in country. There was extensive efforts to increase turnout, to promote turnout both abroad and domestically. In general, I would say this is a good principle to be, having the diaspora community vote. As far as its impact, I think, for all the reasons I discussed previously, the actual, the most important things happened related to this election happened in December and January, in sorting out, whether there were going to be genuine opposition candidates allowed to run, and that turned out not to be the case. As a result, I think that the kind of infrastructure put in place for Egyptians abroad to be able to vote, it could be a useful thing in the future if there are more competitive and freer and fairer elections. In this year's case, that wasn't the reality. So the outcome was never uncertain or in doubt, and therefore, I don't see a really big impact.
Charles, here's a question that I'm going to elaborate on very quickly. Municipalities have low budgets. Many won't have salaries. What do they actually do now that you mentioned that that Parliament finally passed a municipality election bill, but most people, or many people I know anecdotally who went into the elections, had no idea what was in the bill at all. Nor, once the bill is passed, it actually has to be voted on 27 times to actually put it into practice. So between the bill and the practice, there's an enormous space. So we now have these municipalities. To what extent do we know what they'll do, and what kind of powers will they actually exercise?
Well, that is one of the problems. I mean, it was passed on May 1st, just about a week before the elections, so nobody's had a real chance to focus on it. It has to be the subject of further discussion in the Parliament. There's supposed to be a council, a national council, that is also set up, which is to mediate between the local councils and the central government on issues such as authority and budgets and so on. So that's still very much up in the air. You're right, there's a lot of details, but the important point, to me at least, was that the fact that they passed this law in the first place, which was required under the Constitution in 2014. So, yeah, I mean, as always, there's a lot of other details to work out, but I think they're at least, walking along that road right now.
And as you said, not long ago, we assumed that the chances that these elections would be held at all were nil, or next to nil.
That's right.
And that the struggle over the Electoral Committee,
Right.
which was run previously by a friend of mine and colleague, underlined the efforts to interfere with it. So there was a time at which we never expected the elections to take place, and moreover, polling showed an expectation of 5 to 10% participation. So low expectations provide a basis for some optimism here.
Yes.
Okay, Paul, I'm going to ask a question that also applies to Rend, and it echoes the question that I received from the audience. The question goes like this: even though civil society tried to present a viable alternative to the established political order, voters still preferred keeping the traditional political elites and power brokers in office. Civil society groups elected just one member. I suppose the question that's really raised, and Paul, you talked about it, is that we have a shift to a proportional representation system, but it didn't in any way fundamentally undermine the kind of confessional sectarian nature of the political system. And one of the questions raised by the elections in Lebanon, but also even more so in Iraq, is the extent to which elections can serve as an arena for undermining the sort of nature of personal sectarian politics. And certainly it seems from the perspective of Lebanon that the jury is very much out on whether this is in any way changed or whether it represents more of a plus ça change. And I'd also welcome Rend's perspective, because she mentioned this at the end of her presentation, on the extent to which this is a kind of momentary jockeying of political influence, or whether this reflects a real sea change in the way sectarian politics work in Iraq. So those are two big questions which we'll ask for short answers for. Thank you.
Well, in the Lebanese case, I mean, as I said, I think the change in the election law opened a door, but walking through that door is up to voters and political movements and so on. I ran for parliament twice in Lebanon, actually, and I sort of concluded after running that, in a humorous way, I said I was all for democracy until I met the people. To say that, of course we complain about the politicians and this and that, but the population, at least in Lebanon, the vast majority is very sectarian, but even more on election issues, really very much service-oriented and patron-client-oriented. That goes from the, not an extreme, very common behavior of selling votes or renting votes, which is what many voters want to do, because they see no real benefit from the parliament, so they say, well, at least I'll get something for my vote. Those who don't sell it outright, in a way, sell it indirectly through relations that, well, this politician helped my son get a job or served me in some way. In exchange for that, I will give them a vote. That is very deeply entrenched. The civil society campaign was very new. It was disorganized. One can say a lot about, its challenges. And civil society is not, they're not saints. They're not necessarily, unified or much better. But more importantly, they were very new to electoral politics. It's easy to organize a protest. Same can be said maybe in the Egyptian case. that the protests initially were led by, you know, these young activists, but when you run an election, the Muslim Brotherhood is much more effective. But I do think that the change in the election law opens a new kind of era in Lebanon where it is possible to organize new movements. But it doesn't mean that it's easy, and it doesn't mean that these experienced politicians and their networks, they're very capable as well. So yes, maybe plus ça change, plus reste la même, but at least there is a possibility now.
Thank you very much. Rend, do you want to elaborate?
I mean, the paradox is everybody complains about the politicians and that they're sectarian and ethnic and corrupt, but the people keep voting for them. I mean, we re-elect them time and time and time again. So, but on this issue of an anti-sectarian position and whether it is real or fake, I think in the rhetoric, in the public address that the politicians have made in the past election, they all adopted an anti-sectarian, or let us say cross-sectarian, inclusive vocabulary and rhetoric. They all claim to be anti-sectarian and wanted pluralism and so on. Now, some of them meant it more than others. It's all along the spectrum. For example, I think Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi is certainly one of the least sectarian Shia politicians we have on the scene today. Muqtada al-Sadr, how sincere is he? I think he's somewhat sincere in his inclusiveness. He's not no less a Shia, and perhaps he has a Shia political agenda. But I think he sees the danger that exclusive Shia dominance has brought to Iraq. So I think there is something across the spectrum. But in terms of civil society, there is increasing desire to see less sectarian politics, less religion-entrenched politics.
It's very interesting. I mean, and it's interesting just to mention parenthetically that the Saudis were supportive of Muqtada Sadr and provided.
He's in Kuwait as I speak, I believe.
And this is very interesting given Bin Salman's perspective on Iran, and suggests a certain plane of the anti-Iran card, which is interesting there. We have a question about Charles, about Tunisia, Charles, and it says, you said the elections were a message to the two ruling parties, but opposition parties did much worse. How do you explain that? Of course, independents did much better. In many respects, they came out first. I might add just to this question, that is, while the opposition parties did worse, I'm actually impressed by, in some respects, that Ennahda did as well as it did, particularly in certain parts of the country, suggesting a continued importance of sort of Islamist politics in that country. But anyway, you can tackle this anyway.
Yeah, I sort of touched on this in the part of my remarks that I couldn't make.
Well, I'm very happy to have this
so
question
thank
out
you for
there.
the
You're
opportunity,
very,
Mr. Chairman.
It's just my intuition.
No, you know, the fact of the matter remains that the two major parties are probably going to remain in control of most of these municipal bodies. They had to run lists in every one of the every one of the provinces, and while the independents technically did better, a lot of the so-called independent lists are actually affiliated with either Ennahda or Tunis. Many of the independents who are truly independent could end up, as we've seen, for example, in Iraq in some cases, then going into parliament and saying, going into the municipal organizations and identifying with one of the two major blocs, either Ennahda or Nida Tunis. So in some senses, this vote didn't really change the power structure. And senior politicians of both blocs have said, you know, this just, well, of Ennahda, for example, one of the leaders said publicly, essentially, we're still in charge. I'm just paraphrasing, and it just shows you what a democratic party we are, that we can participate in these elections. So I don't think they see at this point a huge threat to their authority. So I would basically leave it at that. The power structure hasn't been shaken up like a snow globe, but it has put a lot of national politicians on notice as to what they can expect in terms of criticism and issues next year.
Great. Steve, here's an interesting question. How were Shafiq and others going to secure the necessary signatures and endorsements in Parliament itself? And that raises sort of a bigger question, which is, after Sisi took over, he dismantled the ruling party, and whatever one thought of the previous system before Sisi and the democratic interlude, which was an interesting and exceptional time, there was a mechanism of party management of elections and a ruling party. What does it mean to have elections in Egypt at all now? Is it in any sense a kind of shell game that means very little? What does it mean to have elections in a system in which it's really the political boss who seems to matter, and parties and electoral systems have been denuded so much of their relevance? And that question that we got about Shafiq not registering or not getting the endorsements is indicative of that. So.
Yeah. So at first, I mean, as you mentioned, under Mubarak, there were not competitive elections, but there was a serious sort of political apparatus for the National Democratic Party, which in many respects is similar to what Paul was describing in Lebanon, where there's sort of transactional kind of services and patronage provided in exchange for votes. Sisi has not been interested in that approach in the same kind of way, but I think that may now be changing. I think he may now be feeling that he needs to develop a sort of party apparatus like the NDP and the role it played for Mubarak. As far as the kind of collection of signatures, in order to qualify for the presidential election, a candidate needed either a number of several thousand signatures of citizens or endorsements from the parliament, one or the other, not both. In general, because the parliament is so dominated by supporters of President Sisi, all of the candidates were focused primarily on securing signatures. There were serious kind of campaigns and efforts underway in that regard. Ahmed Shafiq, in particular, kind of drew on some of these old networks. The old NDP of Mubarak was kind of a coalition that included not only the military, but also this sort of private sector, or the sort of corrupt private sector that his son Gamal Mubarak was very much involved with. And a lot of those kind of private sector, kind of old NDP types were very supportive of Ahmed Shafiq and were helping kind of organizing signature campaigns for him. When Sami Anan was running, he had a pretty serious campaign apparatus. When he was arrested on the 22nd of January, also he had more than 30 staff of his campaign that were also arrested. So they both had pretty serious efforts. Khaled Ali, who was more of a sort of democracy activist, leftist activist, sort of was rallying that kind of civil society community to gather signatures for him. So there were a lot of efforts underway that kind of all obviously came to a halt.
I would just follow up very quickly. I mean, what's Sisi's biggest fear? Is it the return of some of the old guard of the now defunct ruling party? We don't have any real space, and of course we're talking about presidential elections, but we have other elections down the road. We don't have any space at all, talking about the way the system has changed, for organized Islamist parties in a significant way to compete. Is that the red line he wants to draw? Really, what's making him act? What's ticking away that would explain what he really fears in terms of, or is it just simply any loss of power whatsoever, regardless of the consequence?
Yeah, I mean, I think he fears any loss of power, but even kind of less than that, any sort of criticism. He certainly fears figures within the regime kind of turning against him or becoming opposition in any way. I think the last several months have kind of revealed just how kind of anxious he is about his position. He draws the clear lesson from the sort of the revolution that removed Mubarak from power in early 2011. He concludes that the reason Mubarak was overthrown by this uprising was that he had allowed too much space. That especially in his latter years, he allowed a little bit of space for some organizing, including activists who organized the January 25th protests, and he seeks to not repeat that mistake. Now, many others might draw the opposite conclusion, which is that Mubarak was overthrown because he was as repressive as he was, and he didn't deliver for the Egyptian people. But Sisi is focused on kind of preventing any kind of space to organize, which he sees as leading to Mubarak's downfall, so that the same cannot happen to him in the future.
Thank you. There are two more basic questions here. I'm going to put them both out, and our panelists can address them in any way they want, but rapidly. First of all, there's an interesting question here about the low level of political violence in the elections in Lebanon, and in Tunisia and Iraq. When I was in Tunisia, when I worked on the National Dialogue, there was 2 assassinations which led to the National Dialogue in Tunisia. And my colleagues who work on places like Pakistan, they say two assassinations in 1 year, and the Tunisians were really upset. But we deal with 20 a week or whatever. I mean, there's a very high level of political violence. Now here we have a remarkable story. How does one explain that? But particularly in the case of Lebanon, there's always this concern about the breakout of political violence. Yet these are 3 stories in which we don't hear about political violence. So that's one question. And then the other one, and this is specifically on Lebanon, what effect did Hariri's financial troubles and waning support from Saudi Arabia have on the outcome of the Future Movement's loss of more than 1/3 of its seats in parliament? I think you mentioned that, Paul, but here in elaboration. Even though Hariri is now prime minister and is forming a new government, is there a prominent Sunni who could pose a serious challenge to his leadership? So those are the remaining questions.
On the violence in Lebanon, I would say the elections take place with a backdrop of violence. That it's quite clear that Hezbollah in 2005 probably participated in the assassination of the former prime minister. 2008, they took over the capital and forced their will. So there is a bit of a kind of a condition of sort of a hostage population in a way. There's no violence within that activity. It also happens in the backdrop of the violence next door in Syria. And elections were postponed in Lebanon for a number of times because there was a civil war in Syria, and the different factions in Lebanon were waiting to see what the outcome would be. March 14, people hoping, Assad would lose, and the Hezbollah making sure Assad did not. So there's a lot of violence in the backdrop, but no violence in the election itself, and that's a good thing. On the future movement, definitely the absence of money with Hariri himself, particularly, 2 reasons. One, his business troubles in Saudi and elsewhere. Many of his people haven't been paid in months. He didn't have money to show largesse in election season, so as not to call it vote buying, and that really had a big impact on the vote. Also, the fact that he was seen as weak in 2 ways. That he was weak standing up to Hezbollah, and he was humiliated by the Saudis. So it's like a double whammy. And he's not an effective business leader or job creator, a very weak candidate. And yet he is far and away still the main leader of the Sunni community. There is no one competitor to him. There are others who might be named prime minister at some point, as Najib Miati was in the past. So there are figures out there that could be prime minister, but there's no figure or movement that in any way is appearing to be contesting that issue, his leadership, the movement's leadership.
Yeah, on this nonviolence, actually, we haven't had much violence in any of the elections, but first of all, I think to put the record straight, there have been assassinations, and they have not been very publicized. You have to really look among the weeds to discover that a candidate on a particular list has been assassinated. So we have had a few in the run-up to the elections, not on election day, but in the run-up. The other thing is, keep in mind that there was violence in Kirkuk and also in Suleymaniye. And Kirkuk, in fact, the results in Kirkuk are contested more fiercely than the results anywhere else because of the violence that occurred and because of allegations of obstruction of freedom of voters and so on. Suleymaniye, same thing. So we've had some, but it has been remarkably limited, and not in these elections alone, but in previous ones.
Thank you. Charles, would you like to add anything to this question about the absence of violence in Tunisia or not?
No, I mean, I think the fact that there are no reports of violence during the elections is just another sign that, you know, people might be apathetic. They might have serious problems with the government, but they do take the electoral process and the voting very seriously. And it was a sign, a welcome sign of, again, this successful halting, one step, you know, forward, two steps back sometimes, democratic transition.
Yeah, and I might add, by the way, to that, that the fact that the Truth Commission its work has basically been halted, it means that the resolution of these cases is not there. And that creates a lot of pent-up frustration.
true.
And the fact that it's yet to express itself in a more kind of violent context is itself, I suppose, important. It's not every day that when we do a panel on electoral dynamics and democracy in the Arab world, we end on a relatively optimistic note, with the notable exception, I'm afraid, of Egypt, where there's very little basis for optimism. But here we are. It's a really interesting sort of period in which there are some opportunities for changes that perhaps will lead to a more sort of democratic future for some of these countries. Thanks for coming to this event.